Look around any modern city and you'll see them. Grown men with the eyes of boys. Their faces hardened by time, but their spirits still curled in the fetal position of adolescence. They are the man-children. Biologically mature yet emotionally suspended between childhood and adulthood. Like trees that never learned to bend in the wind and now stand rigid against life's storms. These are not simply men who enjoy comic books or video games, but men who have built entire identities around resisting the call to maturity, constructing elaborate fortresses of distraction to avoid confronting the fundamental question every man must eventually face. What will you do with your one wild and precious life? Carl Jung saw this phenomenon coming nearly a century ago when he identified the Puer Aeternus, eternal boy, archetype. That part of the masculine psyche that refuses to grow up, not out of innocence but out of fear. The man-child isn't just an individual failing, he's a cultural symptom, a walking manifestation of our collective avoidance of depth, our terror of limitation, our addiction to possibility at the expense of actuality. He is Peter Pan with a smartphone, Don Juan with daddy issues, a king who refuses his throne because responsibility feels like prison and commitment like death. What makes this modern epidemic so tragic is how it distorts the very gifts it seeks to preserve. The man-child's restless creativity, which could build families and businesses, instead builds endless side projects never completed. His hunger for adventure, which could explore the frontiers of human potential, gets wasted on trophy hunting and Instagram posturing. His natural rebelliousness, which could challenge corrupt systems, gets channeled into resisting bedtime and vegetables like some overgrown toddler. The fire that should warm a household gets scattered in sparks that light nothing. This isn't about nostalgia for some mythical good old days of masculinity. It's about recognizing that when men refuse the journey to maturity, everyone suffers. The women who can't find partners but only overgrown children. The children who need fathers but get fun uncles instead. The society that needs wisdom but gets perpetual adolescence. The man-child's most damning legacy isn't his unfinished projects or broken relationships, but the unrealized potential that dies with every year he spends running from himself. Yet hidden in this pathology lies its own cure. The man-child's refusal to grow up is ultimately a spiritual crisis disguised as a lifestyle choice. His obsession with youth reveals a terror of mortality he's too afraid to name. His collector's mentality, whether it's sneakers, conquests, or certifications, betrays an unconscious hunger for meaning he can't articulate. Even his most frustrating behaviors contain the seeds of transformation. That same energy spent avoiding adulthood could fuel the most magnificent becoming, if only it were pointed towards something real. The way forward isn't shaming these eternal boys, but initiating them, not with artificial machismo or hollow tradition, but with the kind of soul-deep challenge that forces a man to finally look in the mirror and ask, is this who I'm meant to be? The gifts are all there, the creativity, the energy, the passion. They've just been worshipping the wrong gods. The task isn't to kill the boy, but to finally let him grow up. Beneath the surface behaviors of the man-child lies a psychological blueprint written in the language of archetypes and unmet initiations. Jung's concept of the Puer Aeternus reveals this not as mere immaturity, but as a specific relationship with time, responsibility, and the unconscious. The eternal boy lives in perpetual potentiality, always approaching but never arriving, like a man standing eternally at the edge of a diving board, captivated by the possibilities of the plunge but terrified of the irreversible commitment it represents. His world is one of almost and soon, almost ready for commitment, soon to start that meaningful project, perpetually preparing for a life that never actually begins. This temporal suspension creates a peculiar form of suffering where the man-child becomes both the artist and prisoner of his own unfinished masterpiece, endlessly sketching outlines but refusing to apply the final strokes that would complete, and therefore limit, his creation. The shadow side of this archetype manifests in what Jung called the senex, the wise old man who represents everything the pure avoids: structure, discipline, the weight of years. Where the senex has made peace with life's necessary limitations, the pure experiences all boundaries as intolerable constraints. This tension plays out in the man-child's relationships as a simultaneous hunger for and resistance to depth. He may crave intimacy yet sabotage it when it becomes too real, pursuing the thrill of new connection while fleeing the demands of sustained vulnerability. His partners often find themselves playing mother to a grown man, not because they choose to, but because the man-child unconsciously recreates the only relational dynamic he knows, that of a cared-for child rather than the equal adult. The tragedy here is that his avoidance of the masculine initiatory journey leaves him stuck in boyhood patterns while his body and the world around him continue aging, creating an ever-widening gap between his chronological and emotional ages. At the collective level, modern culture has become an enabler of this arrested development, where traditional societies provided clear rites of passage, often involving literal or symbolic death-rebirth experiences. Contemporary life offers only vague milestones devoid of psychological weight. A boy might legally become a man at 18, but without the corresponding inner transformation, the change remains superficial. The digital age has exacerbated this crisis by creating infinite playgrounds for the eternal boy. Video games offering the illusion of mastery without real-world consequences. Social media providing the appearance of connection without depth. Dating apps serving up endless romantic possibilities without demanding genuine commitment. These technologies aren't inherently destructive, but they become so when used as refuges from rather than tools for maturation. The man-child's great irony is that in his desperate flight from limitation, he imprisons himself in the most confining space of all, a perpetual present disconnected from past wisdom and future meaning. Yet the archetypes themselves contain the keys to resolution. The Puer's energy, when properly harnessed, brings creativity, spontaneity, and vision, qualities desperately needed in our often overly rigid world. The task isn't to eradicate the eternal boy, but to integrate him with his counterpart, allowing the Senex to provide the grounding for the Puer's flights of fancy. This alchemical marriage produces what Jung called the divine child, not an arrested adolescent, but a mature man who retains access to wonder while taking responsibility for his place in the world. The transformation requires what all true initiations demand: a voluntary descent into darkness, a confrontation with one's shadows, and ultimately, the courage to trade the infinite possibilities of childhood for the sacred limitations of adulthood. For the man-child, this means learning that real freedom isn't found in avoiding commitments, but in choosing the right ones, that a life without something to die for is a life not worth living. Ancient cultures understood masculine initiation through stories that still resonate today. None more revealing than the Greek myth of Phaeton, the boy who demanded to drive his father Apollo's sun chariot across the sky. This cautionary tale perfectly encapsulates the man-child's dilemma, gifted with divine potential but lacking the maturity to wield it responsibly. When Phaeton ignores warnings and takes the reins, his reckless journey scorches the earth before Zeus must strike him down to prevent total catastrophe. The myth mirrors modern men who seize adult privileges without adult wisdom, the entrepreneur who burns through investors' money-chasing childish fantasies, the lover who wields emotional power without emotional intelligence, the would-be leader who demands authority without having earned the capacity to steward it. Like Phaeton, these men often crash spectacularly, leaving scorched earth relationships and half-built dreams in their wake, while still wondering why the world won't give them another chariot to drive. The Arthurian legends offer another illuminating lens through the figure of Sir Gawain and his encounter with the Green Knight. Where Phaeton represents uninitiated masculine energy run amok, Gawain's journey illustrates the humbling process required to transform boyish bravado into genuine manhood. When the young knight arrogantly accepts the Green Knight's challenge, he believes he's demonstrating courage, only to spend the subsequent year trembling as his appointment with the axe draws nearer. His eventual meeting at the Green Chapel, where he flinches at the final moment and receives only a nick on his neck rather than decapitation, symbolizes the initiatory wound all men must experience, not death, but the death of illusion, the cutting away of childish pretenses about invulnerability. Modern man-children often avoid even this symbolic wound, surrounding themselves with enablers who protect them from ever having to face the consequences of their limitations, leaving them perpetually uninitiated and secretly ashamed of their unfaced cowardice. Perhaps most poignant is the West African tale of the boy who refused to wash, growing increasingly filthy until his own community could no longer recognize him. When elders finally drag him to the river and scrub away the layers of grime, they discover underneath not the child they remembered, but a young man ready to take his place among them. This simple story captures the essential truth about masculine maturation. It cannot be self-administered, just as the boy needed others to see what he couldn't. Modern men require mentors and communities willing to confront them with loving truth. The tragedy of contemporary man-child syndrome lies in its isolation. Men trying to initiate themselves through YouTube tutorials and self-help books, unaware that true growth requires the friction of real relationships with those further along the path. The layers of psychological dirt, the defensiveness, the avoidance, the fragile ego, must be scrubbed away through uncomfortable encounters with reality, not solitary introspection. These myths converge on a fundamental insight. The transition from boyhood to manhood requires symbolic depths that modern society no longer provides. Where tribal cultures created controlled containers for these ego depths, vision quests, battle initiations, elder-guided rituals, contemporary men either avoid them entirely or experience them in distorted, destructive forms. Addiction, incarceration, financial ruin. The man-child's acting out often represents an unconscious attempt to create his own initiation through crisis, not understanding that authentic maturation requires not just suffering but meaning-making from that suffering. His video game avatars level up through simulated challenges while his real character remains undeveloped. His dating app conquests provide the illusion of masculine validation while leaving his actual relational skills stunted. The symbols have become detached from their transformative power, leaving men clutching the empty husks of initiation without accessing their soul-nourishing substance. Yet the persistence of these ancient stories in our collective imagination suggests the path remains available for those willing to seek it. The modern equivalent of Gawain's journey might be the entrepreneur who risks true failure rather than perpetual side hustles, the lover who stays through conflict rather than fleeing to new conquests, the father who models vulnerability rather than performing invincibility. In each case, the pattern remains the same. Confrontation with limitation leads to ego reduction, leads to genuine growth. The man-child's salvation lies not in rejecting his youthful energies, but in channeling them toward worthy struggles that force him to grow into the man he's capable of becoming. The myths were never just stories. They were maps, and the territory they describe still exists for those brave enough to enter it. The transformation from man-child to mature man does not require abandoning modern life for a vision quest in the desert, but rather recognizing that initiation is available in the ordinary moments we typically avoid or sleepwalk through. The alarm clock ringing on a cold morning becomes the first test. Will you rise to meet the day or retreat into the warm denial of the snooze button? The difficult conversation you've been postponing transforms into a trial of courage, not the artificial bravery of posturing, but the real vulnerability of speaking truth and tolerating the consequences. Even traffic jams and bureaucratic frustrations become grist for the mill, opportunities to practice the Seneca's patience rather than the Puer's petulant demand for instant gratification. The key lies in shifting from avoidance to engagement, not just with life's pleasures but with its necessary pains. The friction that polishes a boy into a man. Relationships offer perhaps the most potent modern initiation ritual available. For the man-child trapped in cycles of short-term romance, real growth begins when he stays, not out of inertia, but because he's finally willing to face the mirror that a long-term partner inevitably becomes. Every conflict becomes a chance to outgrow his defensive ego. Every compromise an opportunity to relinquish the childish fantasy of perfect compatibility. Every shared hardship a test of his capacity to provide and receive support. The modern world provides endless escapes from this work. Dating apps that turn people into disposable options. Social media that encourages performative rather than vulnerable connection. A consumer culture that frames relationships as vehicles for personal fulfillment rather than crucibles for mutual growth. The initiated man recognizes these traps and chooses instead the more demanding path of depth, understanding that love is not a feeling to be harvested but a skill to be cultivated through repetition and repair. Professional life similarly morphs from a playground of potential into a proving ground when approached with maturity, where the man-child hops between jobs chasing external validation or the illusion of effortless success. The maturing man learns to derive meaning from mastery itself, the unglamorous work of showing up day after day, tolerating the plateau phases of skill development, and contributing to something larger than his personal ambitions. This shift requires grieving the fantasy of easy greatness and embracing the reality that all meaningful achievement is built on a foundation of mundane effort. The corporate world, with its cult of productivity and performative business, often enables rather than challenges the man-child's tendencies, rewarding the appearance of work over actual substance and favoring short-term results over sustainable growth. The antidote lies in finding or creating work that demands genuine accountability, not just for outcomes but for the kind of man one becomes in the process of striving toward them. Fatherhood, whether biological or spiritual, completes the initiation by forcing confrontation with mortality and legacy. The man-child often fears parenthood not because he dislikes children, but because it represents the ultimate end to his existential deferral. Suddenly there is someone who needs him to be reliable, someone who will mirror back his unresolved wounds, someone whose future will be shaped by his ability to show up fully. Yet this very terror contains the medicine. Nothing motivates maturation like being needed by someone you love. For men without children, the same principle applies through mentorship, teaching, or any role where younger people look to them for guidance. The initiated man understands that his life is no longer just about himself, and in that relinquishment of childish self-absorption, he discovers the paradoxical joy of serving something beyond his personal desires. The cultural implications of this mass maturation would be profound. Imagine a world where men approached politics with the wisdom of elders rather than the competitiveness of boys, where media celebrated depth rather than distraction, where the measure of a man was his capacity for responsibility rather than his ability to avoid it. This is not a nostalgic fantasy, but a practical possibility, one that begins with individual men choosing to undertake the initiations available in their daily lives. The man-child's greatest fear, that growing up means the death of joy, proves exactly backwards in practice. By finally accepting life's limitations, he gains access to its deepest satisfactions. The quiet pride of earned respect, the hard-won intimacy of relationships that have weathered storms, the unshakable confidence that comes from having tested oneself against real challenges. The path forward isn't about rejecting youthfulness, but about integrating it into something larger, allowing the Puer's creativity and vitality to be guided by the Seneca's wisdom and perspective. The modern world suffers not from a lack of men, but from a surplus of uninitiated males, biological adults who've never been shown what genuine maturity looks like or challenged to embody it themselves. Consequences surround us. Relationships starved of depth, leadership devoid of wisdom, a culture increasingly conducted at the pitch of adolescent anxiety. Yet this very crisis contains its own solution, for the pain of prolonged boyhood eventually becomes intolerable, sparking the very hunger for initiation that comfortable modernity suppresses. The call to maturation is not a demand to conform to some outdated masculine ideal, but an invitation to become more fully human, to develop the emotional capacity to hold life's complexity without fleeing into distraction or denial. It asks men to stop asking, "What do I want?" and start considering, "What is mine to do?" To shift from consumption to contribution, from potential to actualization, from the endless pursuit of options to the deep cultivation of chosen commitments. This is neither easy nor straightforward, which is why so many avoid it. But the alternative, a life spent running from the very challenges that confer meaning, is ultimately far more exhausting. For the man-child ready to begin his real work, the path starts with a simple but revolutionary act. Choosing one area of life where he will stop deferring and start engaging, whether that's repairing a neglected relationship, dedicating himself to a craft, or facing the fears he's been medicating with escapism. Progress will be measured not in grand achievements but in micro-victories. The difficult conversation had instead of avoided, the responsibility accepted rather than delegated, the moment of vulnerability embraced rather than deflected. These small acts accumulate into what tribal cultures would recognize as initiation. Not a single event, but a lifelong process of becoming. The secret the man-child has yet to discover is that maturity doesn't confine him. It finally sets him free. Free from the exhausting pretense of perfection. Free from the treadmill of perpetual self-gratification. Free to become someone who matters in the lives of others. The boy's throne remains empty not because it's been taken from him, but because he's been too afraid to claim it. The time has come to sit down, grow up, and get to work. The world needs the men these boys could become.